The late afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the marble floor of the sitting room. Robert Blackwood stood at the center of his newly acquired mansion, hands on his hips, surveying his latest purchase with quiet satisfaction. At 45, he had the confident posture of a man accustomed to owning beautiful things. The estate outside Boston had cost him $12 million and a mere fraction of his tech company's recent valuation. But what caught his eye now was the antique piano, positioned perfectly by the bay window. It was a Steinway Model D concert grand in polished ebony, supposedly once owned by a famous composer, though Robert couldn't recall which one. The previous owner had mentioned it during the sale, but Robert had only half listened. He didn't play, had never learned, but the instrument looked impressive in the room, a conversation piece for the dinner parties he planned to host. "Mr. Blackwood?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a woman in a simple gray uniform standing in the doorway. This must be the new cleaning staff sent by the agency. He'd hired a service to maintain the sprawling property. 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, library, home theater, wine cellar, and outdoor pool, all requiring regular upkeep beyond what his busy schedule allowed. "Yes. Come in," Robert said, checking his watch. The cleaning service wasn't scheduled until tomorrow, but the house manager must have changed the arrangements. "You're here to clean?" "Yes, sir." The woman stepped forward with a slight nod. "I'm Lucia Vasquez. The agency sent me for orientation today. I'll be one of your regular housekeepers twice weekly." Robert noticed she spoke with a slight accent. South American, he guessed. She appeared to be in her late 20s with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. There was something dignified about the way she carried herself despite the plain uniform. Fine, Robert said with a dismissive wave. "Mrs. Chen, my house manager, should be around somewhere. She'll show you what needs to be done." Lucia's eyes drifted past him to the piano, and Robert caught a flicker of something in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or appreciation. It vanished so quickly he wondered if he'd imagined it. "That's a beautiful instrument," she said quietly. "Yes, it is," Robert agreed, surprised by her comment. "Adds character to the room, don't you think?" "Though I don't play myself." Lucia nodded politely and stepped back toward the door. "I'll find Mrs. Chen. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." As she turned to leave, Robert found himself asking, "Do you play?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She paused, one hand resting on the doorframe. "I used to," she said finally with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "A long time ago." Before he could inquire further, his phone rang, his vice president calling about tomorrow's board meeting, and by the time he finished the call, Lucia had disappeared to find Mrs. Chen. Robert quickly forgot about the brief exchange, his mind already occupied with stock projections and investor questions. Over the next few weeks, Robert barely noticed Lucia as she moved efficiently through the house on her scheduled days. He was rarely home during cleaning hours, and when their paths did cross, they exchanged only the briefest pleasantries. She was quiet, thorough, and professional, exactly what he wanted in household staff. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Robert returned home earlier than usual after a canceled meeting. Shaking rainwater from his coat in the grand foyer, he heard Mrs. Chen directing the cleaning staff from the kitchen. He headed toward his home office, passing the sitting room on his way, when he noticed Lucia dusting the piano. There was something almost reverent in the way her cloth moved across the polished surface. She worked methodically, carefully lifting the fallboard to dust the keys without disturbing them. Robert paused in the doorway, watching as she finished with the keys and moved to the music desk. Her fingers lingered just above the ivory for a moment, not touching, but hovering with what seemed like longing before she closed the fallboard again. Sensing his presence, Lucia turned suddenly, her expression shifting from wistful to professional in an instant. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, I was just finishing in here." "No need to apologize," he said, stepping into the room. "You're doing your job." He walked over to the piano, running his fingers along its smooth edge. "You said you used to play?" Lucia nodded, folding her dusting cloth neatly. "Yes, a very long time ago." "Were you any good?" The question came out more bluntly than he'd intended. A shadow of something, pride perhaps, crossed her face before she gave a modest shrug. "I was adequate." Robert sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Instead, he opened the fallboard, revealing the pristine keys. I bought this because it looks impressive. Seems a waste that nobody ever plays it. Lucia's eyes followed his hand as he randomly pressed a key, the single note hanging in the air between them. Some things are worth having just for their beauty, she said quietly. But an instrument like this, it should make music. Maybe someday I'll learn, Robert said with a chuckle, though they both knew he likely never would. Men like him didn't start piano lessons in their 40s. They hired musicians for parties when they wanted music. The conversation might have ended there. Another brief, forgettable exchange, if not for what happened next. As Lucia turned to leave, Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway. Mr. Blackwood, the caterers called about your dinner party Saturday. They need to confirm the final menu. The dinner party. Robert had almost forgotten. He was hosting several potential investors, hoping to secure funding for his company's expansion into European markets. Tell them the menu we discussed is fine, he said, then added on impulse, and we'll need music. Something elegant but not too stuffy. I'll call the usual agency, Mrs. Chen replied efficiently. Robert's eyes drifted to Lucia, who was gathering her cleaning supplies. A crazy idea struck him. Actually, wait, he said. Maybe we don't need to hire anyone. Mrs. Chen looked confused. Sir? Lucia used to play, he explained, gesturing toward the piano. Isn't that right? Lucia froze, clearly caught off guard. Mr. Blackwood, would you consider playing at my dinner party? Robert asked. I'd pay you, of course. Same rate as a professional. It would save me the trouble of bringing in someone new. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained silent, waiting for Lucia's response. Lucia stared at him, clutching her basket of cleaning supplies. For a moment, Robert thought she might refuse. Then she set the basket down carefully. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the piano bench. Robert nodded, curious now. He expected her to play a simple melody, perhaps chopsticks or something equally basic. Mrs. Chen remained in the doorway, also watching with interest. Lucia sat down, adjusting the bench with the familiarity of someone who had done so countless times before. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes briefly, and then began to play. The piece started softly, a gentle, flowing melody that Robert vaguely recognized but couldn't name. Classical, certainly, but not one of the obvious pieces that appeared in commercials or movie soundtracks. As her fingers moved across the keys, Robert noticed how different she looked. Her posture transformed. Her face relaxed yet focused in a way he'd never seen before. The music swelled, growing more complex, her hands moving with increasing confidence and speed. This wasn't the playing of someone who was merely adequate. This was skill born of years of dedicated study and practice. Robert found himself moving closer, mesmerized by the unexpected performance unfolding in his sitting room. Mrs. Chen had stepped fully into the room now, her usual efficient manner forgotten as she, too, was drawn in by the music. When Lucia finished, the final notes lingered in the air. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then she turned on the bench to face Robert, her expression unreadable. I might be a little out of practice, she said softly, her hands now folded in her lap. Robert stared at her in astonishment. Out of practice? That was extraordinary. Where did you learn to play like that? A flash of something, pain perhaps, crossed Lucia's face before she answered. I studied at a conservatory in my home country, before I came to America. Venezuela, Mrs. Chen said suddenly, surprising them both. When they turned to look at her, she added, Your employment paperwork. I remember processing it, Lucia nodded. Yes, in Caracas. Robert was still trying to process what he'd just witnessed. The woman who had been quietly cleaning his home for weeks was clearly a trained concert pianist. The disconnect between her obvious talent and her current occupation left him momentarily speechless. So, Lucia said, rising from the bench and smoothing her uniform, about your dinner party. What kind of music were you thinking of? Robert laughed, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room. After that performance, I think I'll leave the selection entirely up to you. As Lucia returned to her cleaning duties and Mrs. Chen departed to call the caterers, Robert lingered by the piano, occasionally glancing at the woman now vacuuming the adjacent room. He realized he knew almost nothing about her beyond her name and now, her remarkable talent. What circumstances had brought a conservatory-trained pianist to clean houses in Boston? What story lay behind the careful dignity she maintained while performing menial tasks? For the first time since she'd entered his home, Robert found himself genuinely curious about Lucia Vasquez and completely unaware that the impulsive invitation to play at his dinner party would change both their lives in ways neither could possibly imagine. Saturday evening arrived with a flurry of activity at the Blackwood mansion. The catering staff bustled through the kitchen, arranging delicate appetizers on silver trays. Florists made final adjustments to elaborate centerpieces, while bartenders stocked the bar with top-shelf liquor. Robert had spared no expense for this gathering, potential investors who could help expand his tech company across Europe. Standing before his bedroom mirror, Robert adjusted his tie for the third time. The navy suit had been tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders, making him look both powerful and approachable, the exact image he wanted to project tonight. Success hinged on making these wealthy individuals feel comfortable enough to trust him with millions of their dollars. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, reaching for his cufflinks. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Everything is ready, Mr. Blackwood. The first guest should arrive in about 20 minutes. "Excellent," Robert said, sliding the silver cufflink into place. "And the music?" "Lucia arrived early to prepare. She's in the sitting room now." Robert paused. In the days following Lucia's surprising piano demonstration, he'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined her talent. Perhaps it had been a fluke, one memorized piece performed adequately. Tonight would reveal whether his impulsive decision to have his housekeeper provide the entertainment had been brilliant or foolish. "What is she wearing?" he suddenly thought to ask. Mrs. Chen's expression remained neutral. "Her uniform, sir." Robert frowned. "That won't do." He waved a hand dismissively. "Find her something appropriate. Maybe something from the guest closet? There must be a cocktail dress that would fit her." "I'll see what can be arranged," Mrs. Chen replied, making a note on her clipboard before departing. Downstairs, Robert found Lucia sitting at the piano, her fingers moving silently above the keys, practicing without making a sound. She looked up as he entered, quickly standing. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood." "Evening, Lucia." Robert walked over to the piano, noticing sheet music arranged neatly on the stand. "What will you be playing for us tonight?" "A mixture of classical and some modern pieces arranged for piano," she answered. "Nothing too heavy for a dinner party. Background music while people talk." Robert nodded, pleased with her understanding of the event's needs. He noticed she seemed different tonight, more confident, standing straighter, her eyes brighter. The prospect of playing had transformed her somehow. "Mrs. Chen will find you something more suitable to wear," he said, gesturing at her gray uniform. "Can't have my pianist looking like she might start dusting between sonatas." A flash of something, embarrassment perhaps, crossed Lucia's face before she regained her composure. "That's not necessary, Mr. Blackwood. I'm comfortable as I am." "Nonsense," Robert insisted. "Tonight you're not here to clean. You're a performer." Before she could protest further, Mrs. Chen returned with a simple black dress and matching shoes. "This should fit," she said, handing the items to Lucia. "You can change in the powder room down the hall." Lucia hesitated, then accepted the clothes with a small nod. "Thank you." When she returned 10 minutes later, Robert had to stop himself from staring. The dress was modest but elegant, highlighting her slender frame. With her hair loosened from its usual tight bun and falling in soft waves around her shoulders, she looked like an entirely different person. "Much better," Robert approved. "You'll fit right in with our guests now." Lucia smoothed the unfamiliar fabric, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Where would you like me to start playing?" "As soon as the first guests arrive," he instructed. "Nothing too dramatic at first. Save your impressive pieces for after dinner." The doorbell rang, announcing the first arrivals, and Robert straightened his shoulders. "Showtime," he murmured, more to himself than to Lucia. As the house filled with wealthy investors and their spouses, Lucia played soft, pleasant melodies that floated through the rooms without demanding attention. Most guests barely glanced her way, assuming she was simply a hired musician for the evening. Robert moved among them confidently, shaking hands, laughing at jokes, and steering conversations toward his business expansion plans. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, giving Lucia a break from playing. Robert had instructed Mrs. Chen to set a place for her at the table, not with the staff, but not with the most important guests either. She sat quietly at the far end, barely touching her food, clearly uncomfortable in this unfamiliar setting, surrounded by people discussing stock portfolios and vacation homes. After the main course, as servers cleared plates and poured more wine, Robert stood and clinked his glass for attention. The table quieted as all eyes turned to him. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Before dessert is served, I thought we might enjoy some entertainment." He gestured toward Lucia. "We're fortunate to have a talented pianist with us this evening." Lucia's eyes widened slightly as she realized all attention had suddenly shifted to her. The guests regarded her with polite curiosity. "Actually," Robert continued, a mischievous smile playing at his lips, "you might be surprised to know that Lucia here usually works as one of my housekeepers." A murmur rippled through the guests. A few exchanged glances, clearly wondering if this was some sort of joke. "When I discovered she played piano, I thought, why hire outside entertainment when I have talent right here?" Robert raised his glass in her direction. "So, Lucia, would you honor us with a performance?" The request was phrased politely, but Lucia understood the command beneath it. She had been hired to play tonight after all. Still, the way Robert had introduced her, emphasizing her role as a housekeeper, made her cheeks burn. Rising from her seat with quiet dignity, Lucia made her way to the sitting room, aware of the guests following behind her, wine glasses in hand. They arranged themselves on sofas and chairs, some standing by the fireplace, all watching her with expressions ranging from mild interest to thinly veiled skepticism. Robert positioned himself directly across from the piano, drink in hand. "Play something impressive," he encouraged with a wink. "Show us what you can really do." In that moment, Lucia realized he was treating this as entertainment in more ways than one. The wealthy businessman showing off his surprising discovery, the cleaning lady who could play piano tricks. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down at the bench. Taking a deep breath, she placed her fingers on the keys. The room fell silent, waiting. Instead of starting with something safe, Lucia made a split-second decision. She would play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, one of the most technically challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. From the first powerful chords, she commanded the room. Her fingers flew across the keys with precision and passion that belied her earlier nervousness. The complex emotional piece filled the space, silencing all conversation. Several guests who had been scrolling through phones suddenly looked up, startled by the unexpected virtuosity. Robert's smug smile faded, replaced by genuine astonishment as he watched Lucia's transformation. Gone was the quiet, unassuming housekeeper. In her place sat a confident artist completely absorbed in her craft. Her body swayed with the music, her face expressing every emotion in the powerful composition. A wealthy investor named Thomas Phillips, known in financial circles for his appreciation of classical music, moved closer to the piano, watching Lucia's hands with growing amazement. His wife joined him, her expression one of disbelief. As Lucia built toward the piece's dramatic climax, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. When she finally struck the last thunderous chords, silence hung in the air for several heartbeats before the room erupted in spontaneous applause. "Bravo!" called Thomas, actually rising to his feet. "Absolutely extraordinary." Other guests joined in with enthusiastic praise, crowding around the piano with newfound interest in the woman they had barely noticed before. Questions flew at her from all directions. "Where did you study? Have you performed professionally?" "That was Rachmaninoff, wasn't it?" "Flawlessly executed," Lucia answered politely but briefly, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Her eyes sought out Robert, who stood frozen in place, his expression unreadable. When the crowd finally dispersed enough for him to approach, he leaned against the piano, studying her with new eyes. "That was—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I had no idea." Lucia closed the fallboard gently. "You never asked. The conservatory you mentioned, it wasn't just any music school, was it?" She shook her head slightly. "The Conservatorio de Música Simón Bolívar. I was on track to be a concert pianist." Before Robert could respond, Thomas Phillips approached them, his wife at his side. "Robert, you've been holding out on us," Thomas said, his eyes still on Lucia. "Where on earth did you find her?" "Cleaning service," Robert answered honestly, still processing what he'd just witnessed. Thomas laughed, assuming it was a joke. "No, seriously. He's telling the truth," Lucia said quietly. "I clean his house twice a week." The couple's expressions shifted from amusement to confusion. An uncomfortable silence followed, broken when Mrs. Chen announced that dessert was being served in the dining room. As guests drifted away, Robert remained by the piano. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why are you cleaning houses when you can play like that?" Lucia stood smoothing the borrowed dress. "It's complicated," she replied, her voice barely audible. "And not a story for tonight." Looking into her eyes, Robert saw a depth of experience he hadn't noticed before. Pride mixed with pain, dignity despite circumstances he couldn't begin to understand. "Tomorrow," he decided, "when everyone's gone. I want to hear the whole story." Lucia hesitated, then gave a small nod before walking toward the dining room, leaving Robert alone with the piano and a growing realization that he had stumbled upon someone, truly extraordinary in the most unexpected place. The morning after the dinner party, Robert sat alone in his kitchen nursing a cup of black coffee. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the remains of last night's success, empty wine bottles waiting to be recycled, a few stray napkins the cleaning crew had missed. The investors had been impressed. Thomas Phillips had practically committed to backing the European expansion before leaving, and 3 others had scheduled follow-up meetings. Yet Robert's thoughts weren't on business deals or stock projections. All he could think about was Lucia's performance, those incredible moments when the quiet housekeeper had transformed into something else entirely before his eyes. He checked his watch. She wouldn't arrive for their scheduled conversation for another hour. Robert had instructed Mrs. Chen to adjust the cleaning schedule, giving Lucia paid time to speak with him today instead of performing her usual duties. Finishing his coffee, he wandered into the sitting room, stopping at the piano. He lifted the fallboard and pressed a key, the single note hanging in the air. How different it sounded when he touched it compared to Lucia's playing. He tried to recall what she had told him about her background, something about a conservatory in Venezuela. Clearly there was much more to the story. The doorbell rang precisely at 10 o'clock. When Robert opened the door, he found Lucia standing there in simple jeans and a blue blouse. Not her work uniform, but not fancy either. Her hair was pulled back in her usual practical style, but something about her seemed different. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, with a quiet confidence that hadn't been visible before. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said formally. "Robert," he corrected, stepping aside to let her in. "Please call me Robert today. This isn't a work conversation." Lucia nodded slightly but didn't use his first name. "Old habits, perhaps. Would you like coffee?" he offered, leading her toward the kitchen. "No, thank you," she replied. "I've already had some this morning." "Then let's sit in the study," Robert suggested. "It's more comfortable there." The study was Robert's favorite room in the house, walls lined with books he'd never read but liked the look of, leather furniture chosen more for appearance than comfort, and large windows overlooking the garden. He gestured for Lucia to take one of the armchairs while he settled into another across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. Robert studied her face, noting the slight tension around her eyes, the way her hands rested carefully in her lap. She was waiting for him to begin. "You played beautifully last night," he said finally. "Thank you. Thomas Phillips, the older gentleman who spoke with you, after is a major patron of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He knows music." He was genuinely impressed. Lucia's expression softened slightly. He was kind. He wasn't being kind, Robert insisted. He was being honest. We all were. "What you did at that piano, it was extraordinary." He leaned forward in his chair. "And that's why I need to understand. How does someone with your talent end up cleaning houses in Boston?" Lucia looked down at her hands, quiet for so long that Robert thought she might refuse to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "I was 22 when I left Venezuela. I had been studying piano since I was 4 years old. My entire life was music, practice rooms, competitions, recitals. By the time I was 18, I was performing with orchestras. My teachers said I had a future on the international stage." She paused, a shadow passing across her face. "Then what happened?" Robert prompted gently. "Life happened," Lucia said simply. "The political situation in my country was deteriorating. Food shortages, medicine shortages, violence in the streets. My father lost his engineering job when the company closed. My mother got sick, cancer, and couldn't get proper treatment. My younger brother was still in school. Her eyes met his directly now. Someone had to help the family survive. I had an aunt in Boston who said she could get me work. The tourist visa was easy enough to obtain. I planned to send money home, then return when things improved. Robert nodded slowly, beginning to understand. But things didn't improve. No, Lucia confirmed. They got worse. My visa expired. My mother's condition worsened. My brother needed to finish school. The money I sent home from cleaning jobs was the only steady income they had. But your music. Robert gestured toward the sitting room where the piano stood. To give that up? I didn't have a choice, Lucia said, a hint of steel entering her voice. Music doesn't feed a family or pay medical bills. Robert felt suddenly uncomfortable, aware of the vast gulf between their experiences. His wealth had been built on family connections, prestigious schools, and opportunities that had fallen into his lap. He'd never faced the kind of desperate choices Lucia described. Did you try? He asked. To continue with music here, I mean. There are scholarships, programs. A flash of something like anger crossed Lucia's face before she controlled it. Do you know how many Venezuelan pianists there are in America, Mr. Blackwood? How many musicians from around the world fighting for the same limited spots? Even with my training, without legal status, without connection, she trailed off, shaking her head. I went to one audition. The director was impressed until he asked about my visa situation. She looked around at the expensive furnishings of Robert's study. The classical music world isn't so different from the business world. It's about who you know, who can vouch for you. I was a nobody with expired papers. The room fell silent again. Through the window, Robert could see his gardener trimming hedges, another employee whose personal life he'd never considered before. How long has it been? He asked. Since you've really played, I mean. Not just yesterday, but regularly. Lucia considered the question. 4 years, maybe 5. I used to practice on a keyboard in my apartment when I first arrived, but after it broke, I couldn't afford to replace it. Sometimes I play at my church when no one's around. Robert tried to imagine going 5 years without doing the thing he was best at, the thing that clearly brought her alive. The thought was unbearable, and now? Your family in Venezuela? My mother passed away last year, Lucia said quietly. My father found work again, though it pays very little. My brother graduated and has a job teaching mathematics. Things are stable, not good, but stable. And your papers? Your status here? She tensed visibly. I've applied for asylum. The process is complicated. My lawyer says it could take years. Robert nodded thoughtfully. He knew people who could potentially help with immigration issues, though he'd never had reason to use such connections before. Last night, he said, changing direction, when I asked you to play, did you resent me for it? The question seemed to surprise her. Resent you? For putting you on display. For announcing to everyone that you were my housekeeper before having you perform. Lucia considered his words carefully. At first, yes, she admitted. It felt humiliating, like I was some curiosity for your guests to marvel at. Robert winced. He hadn't considered how his introduction might have sounded to her. But then, she continued, when I started playing, none of that mattered anymore. It had been so long since I performed for anyone who truly understood music. The way some of your guests listened, especially Mr. Phillips, reminded me of what I'd lost. For those few minutes, I wasn't a housekeeper. I was myself again. Her words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Robert found himself moved by her candor, by the dignity she maintained despite circumstances that would have broken many others. An idea began forming in his mind. Impulsive, perhaps, but somehow right. I have a proposal for you, he said, straightening in his chair. I'd like you to play the piano regularly. Here in this house, Lucia blinked, confused. You want me to provide music for your parties? No, Robert shook his head. I want you to play for yourself. To practice. To return to your craft. He gestured broadly. This piano sits silent most of the time. It's a waste. I want to offer you a different position, not as a housekeeper, but as... He searched for the right word. As the house musician. Lucia stared at him, clearly struggling to understand. You want to pay me to practice piano? And to play when I have guests, yes. But mainly to reconnect with your music. To be the pianist you were trained to be. The idea solidified as he spoke. The pay would be better than what you make cleaning. You could use the music room upstairs as a practice studio when I'm at work. The house would be filled with music instead of silence. He could see doubt in her expression, perhaps suspicion about his motives. Why would you do this? Robert considered the question carefully. Why indeed? Was it guilt, charity, or something more complex? A recognition of talent that deserved nurturing, not waste. Because last night I witnessed something extraordinary, he said finally, and I'd be a fool to let it disappear again. He smiled slightly. Besides, I suspect it might impress my business associates more than my art collection does. The hint of a smile crossed Lucia's face, the first he'd seen from her. And cleaning? Who would do that? The service can send someone else. Mrs. Chen will arrange it. Lucia stood and walked to the window, looking out at the carefully manicured grounds. Robert could almost see the thoughts racing through her mind, pride wrestling with practicality, opportunity against suspicion. I would need time, she said at last, turning back to face him. To prepare properly, to build back my technique. It's been years. Take all the time you need, Robert replied, sensing she was considering his offer. The piano isn't going anywhere. Lucia nodded slowly, something like hope flickering in her eyes. Then yes, she said softly. I accept your proposal, Mr. Blackwood. Robert, he corrected again with a smile. Robert, she repeated, the name still awkward on her tongue. Neither could have guessed in that moment how much their lives were about to change, or how a simple shift from housekeeper to musician would lead them both down paths they never expected to travel. 3 months passed quickly after Lucia accepted Robert's unusual offer. The first few weeks had been awkward as they both adjusted to the new arrangement. Mrs. Chen had raised an eyebrow, but made the necessary scheduling changes without comment. The cleaning service sent someone else, a middle-aged woman named Gloria who kept to herself and never looked twice at the piano. Lucia typically arrived at 9 each morning, after Robert had left for his office downtown. She would spend hours in the music room upstairs, which he had converted into a proper practice studio with sound-dampening panels and music stands. The grand piano remained in the sitting room, but Robert had added an upright to the studio so she could practice without worrying about disturbing anyone. At first, her playing had been hesitant. Years without regular practice had left her fingers stiff, her technique rusty. She would become frustrated, stopping mid-piece to repeat difficult passages over and over. Some days she left early, discouraged by the gap between what her mind remembered and what her hands could execute. But gradually, the music that filled the house grew more confident. Robert would sometimes arrive home to find her still at the piano, so absorbed in playing that she didn't hear him enter. On those occasions, he would stand quietly in the doorway, watching her lose herself in the music, struck by how different she looked from the reserved woman who had once dusted his bookshelves. One chilly autumn evening, Robert returned from work earlier than usual. Soft piano music drifted from the sitting room, not the intense classical pieces Lucia usually practiced, but something gentler, more modern. He recognized it as a film score, though he couldn't place which one. He found her at the grand piano, eyes closed as her fingers moved across the keys. She hadn't heard him come in, so he leaned against the doorframe, content to listen. The piece was hauntingly beautiful, full of emotion that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. When she finished, the final notes hanging in the air, he couldn't help but applaud. Lucia started, her eyes flying open. Sorry, Robert said, stepping into the room. I didn't want to interrupt. It's fine, she replied, closing the fallboard. I was just finishing anyway. What was that piece? I don't think I've heard you play it before. A slight flush colored her cheeks. It's nothing. Just something I've been working on. Robert moved closer to the piano, noticing there was no sheet music on the stand. Did you compose that yourself? Lucia hesitated before nodding. It's not finished yet. It's beautiful, Robert said sincerely. I didn't know you composed. I used to, she admitted. At the conservatory, we were required to take composition courses. I haven't written anything in years, but lately... She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Lately? Robert prompted. Lately, I've had music in my head again, ideas, melodies. She gave a small shrug. It feels good to get them out. Robert smiled, oddly moved by this new revelation. Will you play more of your compositions for me sometime? When they're ready, Lucia promised with a slight smile. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A letter on the side table. The envelope bearing the logo of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. His step faltered. "Good news?" he asked, gesturing toward the letter. Lucia's expression clouded. "Not exactly. My asylum case is complicated. My lawyer says we need more evidence of the dangers I would face if returned to Venezuela." She picked up the letter, folding it carefully. "It's fine. Just part of the process." Robert nodded, though he could see the worry in her eyes. Immigration issues weren't something he knew much about, but he made a mental note to look into it further. Perhaps his connections could be useful after all. "Are you hungry?" he asked, changing the subject. "I was thinking of ordering dinner. Too tired to cook." Lucia glanced at her watch. "Oh, I should go. It's past my usual hours." "Stay," Robert said, surprising himself with the invitation. "Have dinner. You can play more of your music afterward if you'd like." She hesitated, clearly weighing the impropriety of dining with her employer against the temptation of more time at the piano. "All right," she agreed finally. "Thank you." That evening marked a subtle shift in their relationship. Over takeout containers of Thai food, they really talked, for the first time. Not about music or work, but about their lives. Robert told her about his divorce 5 years earlier, his estranged relationship with his brother, his collection of vintage motorcycles gathering dust in the garage. Lucia spoke of her childhood in Caracas, her father teaching her to swim in the Caribbean, the street food she missed from home. As weeks passed, these evenings became more frequent. Sometimes they would listen to recordings together, Lucia explaining the nuances of different pianists' interpretations. Other times Robert would work in his study while Lucia played in the sitting room, the music a pleasant backdrop to his emails and spreadsheets. Thomas Phillips, the investor from the dinner party, became a regular visitor to the house. A genuine music lover, he would bring recordings and scores for Lucia, discussing techniques and composers with an enthusiasm that matched her own. He introduced her to contacts at the New England Conservatory, arranging for her to audit master classes despite her unofficial status. On a snowy December afternoon, Thomas arrived with a thick envelope in hand, his face alight with excitement. "I've been speaking with the director of the Boston Chamber Music Society," he announced without preamble. "They're holding auditions next month for a special performance series." I showed him the video of you playing at Robert's last dinner party. "Video?" Lucia asked, surprised. "What video?" "The one I recorded on my phone," Robert admitted sheepishly. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to remember the performance." "Anyway," Thomas continued, "he was impressed enough to offer you an audition. It's not a permanent position, just a special showcase of emerging talents, but it would be a foot in the door." Lucia stared at the envelope containing the audition details, her expression a mixture of longing and apprehension. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. "It's too soon. My technique still needs work." "Nonsense," Thomas insisted. "Your playing has soul. Technical perfection isn't everything." "He's right," Robert added. "You're more than ready. You've been practicing for months, and if I get it, what about my status? They'll need documentation, work permits." Robert and Thomas exchanged glances. "Let us worry about that," Robert said. "I've been speaking with an immigration attorney. There are options for artists, special visas." Lucia looked between the two men, a shadow crossing her face. "I don't need charity," she said stiffly. "And I don't want to be your project." "This isn't charity," Thomas responded firmly. "This is recognition of talent. The music world needs artists like you." "And you're definitely not a project," Robert added softly. "You're—" He paused, suddenly aware of Thomas's curious gaze. "You're a musician. A brilliant one. This is where you belong." Later, after Thomas had left, Lucia stood by the window watching snow blanket the garden. Robert joined her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "You don't have to do the audition if you truly don't want to," he said, "but I hope you'll consider it." "It's not that I don't want to," Lucia replied, her breath fogging the cold glass. "It's that I'm afraid." "Of what?" She turned to face him. "Of hoping again. When I came to this country, I put all those dreams away. I had to survive. Now you and Thomas want me to take them out again, dust them off." She shook her head. "What if it doesn't work? What if I fail? What if my papers don't come through?" Then you'll be exactly where you are now, Robert said gently. Except you'll know you tried. Lucia studied his face, searching for something. Why are you doing all this? Honestly, Robert considered the question carefully. Over the past months, his motivations had shifted in ways he was only beginning to understand. What had started as an impulsive offer born of guilt and fascination had become something deeper, a genuine desire to see her succeed, to watch her reclaim the life she deserved. Because music matters, he said finally, and because you matter. The simple honesty of his answer seemed to surprise her. For a moment, the careful distance they had maintained, employer and employee, patron and artist, wavered. I'll think about the audition, she said quietly. That night, as Robert worked late in his study, he heard the piano come alive downstairs. Lucia was playing with an intensity he hadn't heard before, not practicing, not composing, but playing as if her life depended on it. The music surged through the house, powerful and raw. He knew then that she had made her decision. She would audition. She would take the risk. She would hope again. And somehow, without either of them planning it, her journey had become intertwined with his own. The woman who had once cleaned his house was now filling it with music, and in the process, awakening parts of himself he hadn't known were sleeping. The morning of Lucia's audition arrived with a blanket of fresh snow covering Boston. Robert insisted on driving her to the conservatory himself, despite her protests that she could take the subway. As his sleek black car navigated the slippery streets, Lucia sat silently in the passenger seat, her portfolio of music clutched tightly in her hands. Nervous? Robert asked, glancing over at her. Terrified, she admitted with a small smile. It's been so long since I've played for judges. In Venezuela, before everything happened, auditions were just part of life. Now it feels like my entire future depends on the next 30 minutes. You're going to be brilliant, Robert assured her, pulling up outside the imposing brick building of the New England Conservatory. Remember what Thomas said. They're already impressed by your video. This is just a formality. Lucia nodded, though her knuckles were white around the portfolio. Thank you. For everything. I'll be waiting right here, he promised as she stepped out of the car. Take all the time you need. Watching her walk toward the entrance, back straight and head high despite her obvious nerves, Robert felt an unexpected surge of pride. 6 months ago, she had been dusting his piano, too afraid to even touch the keys. Now she was walking into one of the most prestigious music institutions in the country, ready to reclaim her place in that world. The 90 minutes she was inside felt like an eternity. Robert answered emails on his phone, made a few business calls, and tried not to watch the clock. When Lucia finally emerged, her expression was unreadable as she approached the car. Well? He asked as she slid into the passenger seat. How did it go? For a moment, Lucia stared straight ahead, her face still composed. Then slowly a smile broke across her features, not the reserved, polite smile he was accustomed to, but something radiant and unrestrained. They want me to play in the spring showcase, she said, her voice trembling slightly. 3 solo pieces and a collaboration with their string quartet. Lucia, that's wonderful. Robert resisted the impulse to hug her, settling for a warm smile instead. I knew you could do it. The director said my Rachmaninoff interpretation was refreshingly authentic, she continued, her words tumbling out now. And they loved my original composition, the one you heard me playing that night. They want me to include it in the program. As Robert pulled away from the curb, he suggested lunch to celebrate. They found a small cafe near the conservatory, where Lucia recounted every detail of her audition over bowls of soup and crusty bread. Her entire demeanor had changed. She was animated, gesturing with her hands as she spoke, her eyes bright with excitement. There's just one problem, she said finally, her expression sobering. They need proof of my legal status before they can officially include me in the program. The director was very understanding, but there are rules. Robert nodded thoughtfully. I've been meaning to talk to you about that. My attorney has been looking into your case. There's a special visa category for artists of extraordinary ability. With Thomas's connections in the music world and letters from the conservatory, we might have a path forward. Lucia set down her spoon, studying his face. Why would you go to so much trouble for me? The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken complexity. Robert considered his answer carefully. When I first hired you to play at that dinner party, it was on a whim. I didn't expect anything beyond some background music. He met her eyes directly, but what I heard that night changed something in me. For years, I've been surrounded by beautiful things I've purchased. Art, cars, this house, without really appreciating any of it. Your music woke me up, reminded me that true talent is beyond price. He paused, slightly embarrassed by his earnestness. Besides, my life is better with your music in it. The house feels alive now. A faint color rose in Lucia's cheeks. Thank you, she said softly, for believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. The months leading up to the showcase passed in a blur of preparation. Lucia practiced relentlessly, refining her program with input from teachers at the conservatory who had taken an interest in her unusual story. Robert adjusted his work schedule to attend her rehearsals when possible, watching from the back of empty recital halls as she collaborated with other musicians for the first time in years. The immigration attorney Robert had hired was cautiously optimistic about Lucia's case. Letters poured in from prominent figures in Boston's music community, including Thomas Phillips and several professors from the conservatory, attesting to her exceptional ability. The director of the Boston Chamber Music Society wrote a passionate endorsement after hearing her rehearse, declaring her a once-in-a-generation talent. One evening in late February, as heavy snow fell outside, Robert arrived home to find Lucia sitting at the kitchen table, an official-looking letter open before her. Her face was tear-stained but radiant. "My visa application was approved," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 years with a path to permanent residency if I continue performing and teaching. Robert felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a worry he hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. "That's incredible news. I can stay," Lucia said, the simple words carrying enormous weight. "I can play music again, officially." That night she played for hours, joyful, triumphant pieces that filled the house with celebration. Robert sat in the sitting room, work forgotten, simply listening as Lucia poured her relief and happiness into the music. The night of the showcase arrived on a mild spring evening. The recital hall at the conservatory was filled to capacity. Music lovers, critics, conservatory students, and faculty, all curious about the Venezuelan pianist with the unusual story. Thomas Phillips had spread the word through his extensive network, ensuring a distinguished audience. Backstage, Robert found Lucia in a small practice room, running through silent fingering exercises on her lap. She wore a simple black gown, a gift from Thomas's wife, with her mother's pendant around her neck. She looked up as Robert entered, her expression a mixture of terror and exhilaration. "I can't do this," she whispered. "There are so many people." Robert sat beside her on the narrow bench. "Do you remember the first time you played for me? Not at the dinner party, but before that. When I asked if you played and you sat down at the piano." Lucia nodded slightly. "You weren't playing for me then," Robert continued. "You were playing for yourself. Do that tonight. Forget everyone else is there." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Will you be in the audience?" "Front row center," he promised. "But don't look for me. Just play." When Lucia walked onto the stage 30 minutes later, the audience fell silent. If they had expected to see nervousness or hesitation, they were disappointed. The woman who approached the piano moved with confidence and purpose, acknowledging their applause with a graceful nod before taking her place at the bench. From the first notes of Bach's Italian concerto, it was clear they were witnessing something special. Lucia played with technical brilliance, yes, but also with a depth of emotion that spoke of real-life experience, of loss and struggle, of rediscovery and joy. Each piece in her program told part of her story, building to her original composition, which she introduced simply as New Beginnings. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence before the hall erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, some wiping away tears. Critics in the audience exchanged glances that said more than their eventual reviews would. Thomas Phillips beamed from his seat in the second row, already mentally drafting the funding proposal for a scholarship in Lucia's name. And Robert, watching from the front row as promised, felt something he couldn't quite name. Pride and wonder, certainly, but also a bittersweet awareness that Lucia's world was expanding beyond the walls of his home. Her talent would take her to places he couldn't follow. At the reception afterward, Lucia was surrounded by admirers and potential mentors. Offers came pouring in, Teaching positions, collaboration requests, invitations to summer festivals. Robert stood at a distance, nursing a glass of champagne, content to watch her shine. Late that evening, as the crowd thinned, Lucia found him near the door. "Ready to go home?" he asked, realizing as he said it that home might soon mean something different for her. "Yes," she said, surprising him by slipping her arm through his. "But first I have something to ask you. Anything. The conservatory has offered me a position, teaching and performing. I'd be working with students giving recitals." "That's wonderful," Robert said, genuinely happy for her despite the pang of loss. "You deserve it." "But I was thinking," Lucia continued, her eyes meeting his, "I don't want to give up our evening sessions entirely. The house, the piano, they're part of my journey now." She hesitated. "Unless you'd prefer to hire a different house musician?" Robert laughed, relief flooding through him. "I'm afraid the position is permanently filled. No other applicants need apply." As they stepped out into the cool spring air, Robert realized how completely his life had changed. Since that day, he'd impulsively asked his housekeeper to play the piano. What had begun as a casual challenge had become the most meaningful connection in his life. "You know," he said as they walked toward his car, "I never actually thanked you." "For what?" Lucia asked, genuinely puzzled. "For showing me what it means to truly love something, to be willing to fight to get it back." He smiled down at her. "Before you, my house was just a showcase. Now it has music. And before you," Lucia replied softly, "my music had nowhere to go. Now it has a home." Together they drove back through the Boston night, back to the mansion where a piano waited, no longer just an expensive showpiece, but a bridge that had connected two unlikely lives in perfect harmony.